The story of Jack the Ripper is one of the most chilling true crime mysteries in history, a tale of horror that still captivates the world more than a century later. His identity remains unknown, but his gruesome crimes terrorized the streets of London's East End in 1888, leaving a trail of death, fear, and unanswered questions. The terror begins in the late summer of 1888. Whitechapel, a poverty-stricken area of London, was home to some of the city's most vulnerable people. The streets were filled with women working as prostitutes, struggling to make ends meet. The narrow, fog-choked alleys of the East End were infamous for their filth, crime, and overcrowding. But no one could have anticipated the horror that was about to descend on these already bleak streets. On August 31, 1888, the body of 43-year-old Mary Ann Nichols was found in Bucks Row, Whitechapel. She had been brutally murdered, her throat slashed deeply twice and her abdomen viciously mutilated. The police were baffled by the level of violence, which seemed not only excessive but deliberate, as though it had been done with skill. It wasn't long before they realized they were dealing with something far more sinister than just another murder in the slums. Only days later, on September 8th, the Ripper struck again. This time, the victim was 47-year-old Annie Chapman. Her body was found behind a house on Hanbury Street, mutilated in a similarly brutal fashion to Mary Nichols, but worse. Her throat was cut, her abdomen ripped open, and parts of her organs removed. Whoever had killed her had done so with terrifying precision, leading some investigators to suspect that the murderer had medical knowledge. Panic spread through Whitechapel like wildfire. Women were afraid to go out at night. Rumors of Leather Apron, a shadowy figure who stalked the streets, began to circulate. But the police were no closer to catching the killer, who was already being referred to as Jack the Ripper after a letter supposedly written by the murderer was sent to the authorities, taunting them with his intent to continue killing. The murders escalate in the early hours of September 30th. Jack the Ripper committed 2 murders in a single night, escalating the horror in what became known as the double event. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride, found in Dutfield's yard. Her throat had been slashed, but unlike the others, she had not been mutilated. It was thought that the Ripper was interrupted before he could finish his grisly work. Less than an hour later, in Mitre Square, the Ripper struck again, this time with unrelenting savagery. Catherine Eddowes was found mutilated in ways even more grotesque than the previous victims. Her face had been slashed, her abdomen torn open, and her kidney removed. A piece of her apron, soaked in blood, was found later near Goulston Street, alongside cryptic graffiti that read, "The U's are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Whether it was a message from the killer or a red herring is still debated. The brutality of the murders stunned the public. The Ripper was killing with impunity, walking the dark streets of Whitechapel like a ghost, leaving behind no clear clues except for the horrific state of the bodies. His ability to evade capture and his horrific methods earned him an almost mythical status, a faceless butcher who struck at random, instilling terror in the hearts of all who lived in the East End. The final murder, the most horrific and final known murder attributed to Jack the Ripper, took place on November 9, 1888. Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest and perhaps the most tragic of his victims, was found in her small room at 13 Miller's Court. Her mutilation was so severe that her body was barely recognizable. Kelly's throat was slashed so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. Her face was mutilated beyond recognition, her abdomen ripped open and her organs strewn across the room. It was a scene of unthinkable carnage, unlike anything even the most hardened investigators had seen before. Unlike the other murders, which took place on the streets, this one had occurred indoors, giving the killer more time to indulge in his grotesque butchery. After the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, the killings stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The Ripper disappeared, vanishing into the foggy streets of London, leaving behind a legacy of fear, death, and endless mystery. The aftermath and legacy. The police, despite extensive efforts, never caught Jack the Ripper. Hundreds of suspects were interviewed and many were arrested, but none were definitively linked to the crimes. Over the years, numerous theories have surfaced, naming everyone from prominent doctors to members of the royal family as the elusive killer. Yet to this day, no one knows for certain who Jack the Ripper was or why he stopped killing. What makes the Jack the Ripper case so terrifying is not just the brutal nature of the murders, but the anonymity of the killer. In a city as large and populated as London, the Ripper moved unseen, selecting his victims with precision and vanishing before anyone could catch him. His taunting letters, his surgical precision, and the sheer brutality of his crimes suggest he was more than just a random madman. He seemed to revel in the terror he was causing, feeding off the fear that rippled through the streets with each new murder. The Ripper's shadow still looms large over London, and his story has become part of the city's dark folklore. What truly terrifies people about Jack the Ripper is the fact that he was never caught. He could have been anyone, a doctor, a butcher, a neighbor. The thought that such evil could walk among us unseen and unpunished is a horror that will forever haunt those who study his crimes. More than 130 years later, Jack the Ripper remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of all time. A faceless, nameless monster who committed some of the most heinous murders in history and then disappeared without a trace, leaving the world to wonder who he was and what darkness lived within him.